Well, we just appreciate everyone who came this morning because we know that your time is valuable and so making the effort to come, we know means that you've given up time someplace else. So we really appreciate that. Today's event is put on by, we want to thank Vincent Peters and the Office of Off-Campus Programs for providing us a little bit of extra nourishment here this morning. Today's event is put on by the Faculty Development Team and the Friends of the Community Library. Dr. Matthew Mayhew is interested in how collegiate conditions, educational practices, and student experiences influence learning and democratic outcomes ranging from moral reasoning to high-risk drinking behaviors. Dr. Mayhew has published articles in Research in Higher Education, Journal of Higher Education, Review of Higher Education, the NASPA Journal, there's a lot, sorry. He has co-authored a chapter in Higher Education Handbook of Theory and Research. Dr. Mayhew has also received several grants for exploring the impact of college on student outcomes, including but not limited to moral reasoning, spirituality, high-risk drinking, and innovative entrepreneurship, which is part of why he's here today. Dr. Mayhew received his undergraduate degree from Wheaton College, his master's from Brandeis University, and he's earned his doctorate in higher education administration with a focus on research, evaluation, and assessment from the University of Michigan. Dr. Mayhew is currently a professor at New York University, and he's my friend. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Mayhew.
Thank you, Amy. You left out our major connection.
That's true.
Amy's brother and I are really good friends from Wheaton. And so we met that way. So I met Amy a long, long time ago. I don't want to date myself there. I'm feeling like the feng shui of the room is leaning right. So I'm also feeling like, for some reason, just like my students on the first day of class, there's no one in here. I really want to be Viola Davis. Remember that new show, How to Get Away with Murder? I don't know if you've seen the clips for that, but she's so like amazingly hard and like honored, like Socratic and stuff. So I'm not going to tell you to move. I'm just going to kind of like let it go for now and not be Viola in this moment. That's what I'm thinking about. So I want to thank you for coming. I know this is taking us a large chunk of your day, and you're often very busy with the throes of university life. One of the things I wanted to start with is being transparent and saying this is the first time I've spoken to a group of folks at an evangelical school about this topic. And so I have done a lot of wrestling, toying with the presentation, thoughtful reflection, praying about how to kind of frame this for this audience as well as the folks I'm going to be meeting later today. The first couple of ideas I wanted to throw out there in that spirit is this idea of reclaiming what we think about when we think about interfaith. Okay? Interfaith for me means a variety of things. It means trying to understand differences across religious and spiritual worldview, as well as differences within a particular worldview. What we know about race in terms of studying our students is there's more variation within race than there ever is between race. And as emerging studies of religion kind of come out, we're starting to see the same patterns. There's more variation under a certain term or label or self-identification pattern than there is actually between those identification patterns. To bring this story home a little bit, when I was first at Wheaton, I was in an Old Testament class taught by Andy Hill. I don't know if any of you know Andy. And in that class, a student stood up in the first 2 weeks of class, and she said that she didn't believe that anybody would go to heaven if they hadn't spoken in tongues. I come from a Baptist tradition, so this for me was very jarring. And to unpack that over the course of a semester in Old Testament was, I think, equally jarring for Andy. But what it represents is this idea that we all have different approaches to understanding our faith. So the idea of interfaith is something that goes between religions, but also between variations within a religion. And that's something I think that's pretty important to say. The other important thing to note is that in doing this work, there are a lot of assumptions often made of my work based on kind of where I'm at New York University, maybe some of the writings that I've done with regard to thinking about students' political choices. I want to say that we're very careful in this study and in what you're about to see today to ensure that when we're talking about commitment to one's faith, we're talking about how do students make meaning of their commitment when encountering different ideas. We're not asking for students to abandon their commitment to their faith as a result of going to college. What we do want them to do is wrestle with it by interacting with different folks in order to either strengthen it or question it. But we're not asking students to go to college to abandon it. And I need to make that crystal clear. And so in some of the constructs you're going to see, even though I am a quantitative person, we were incredibly careful to reflect kind of that value in kind of what we're doing. So I wanted to just state those two things up front. As we go throughout the talk today, there are a couple of nerdy things I've got to get out of the way. Well, actually, it's all nerdy, and I apologize for that ahead of time. I'm a total nerd, quantitative geek, and I'll talk about that as we go through. But situating some assumptions about learning and knowledge, talking a little bit about college influence and how we deconstruct it, and talking about specifically how we deconstruct the college environment with regard to understanding worldviews and the climate for understanding freedom of expression for worldview, for example. Specific purpose of the study, some logistics, overview of data, discussion points, and this larger project that's now been funded. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that on the back end. As we go through, I'm sensing the room is small enough that we can kind of do one of these, dynamic, even though the hierarchy is in place with the suit, the podium, and the computer. I want you to feel like you can kind of just throw questions out as we go, because I think that would be enriching, and I can flex and punt through the presentation, so don't worry about that. I'm not going to go over time or anything like that. So, okay, so this is a lot of words, and I don't like words so much, but what we need to do when we start thinking about measuring things like spirituality or interfaith outcomes is we need to be very explicit by saying that our ontology of learning is that learning is important, but it's also something that can be measured, okay? There are nuances to learning that may not be able to be measured, and that's fine. But there are nuances to learning that can be, okay? And this is a sticking point for a lot of folks. When I start talking about interfaith outcomes, when I start talking about measuring spirituality, I do have folks in the room who are often questioning my very ontology with regard to those things. What is real? What is real? Is this something that is real? If it is real, can it be measured? What does that mean? How does ontology meet epistemology? All of those types of things. So I am here to say that I can measure it. I have measured it. It is not a complete measure. It is not the silver bullet to understanding all things interfaith or spiritual. I will have other people from other paradigms consistently question whether these things can be measured. Often those folks embrace a kind of a more, I want to say, organic way of thinking about the world and life and life around it. And if I wanted to take up this argument, I could do a whole presentation on it, and I would still not be convincing for some people who have that certain worldview or that certain orientation toward knowledge. They are always going to believe that these things are too ineffable to study. That's an argument that has been, is, and will always be among faculty across disciplines until the end of time. So if you will allow me or afford me a little bit of flexibility here in suggesting that maybe some of these complex, rich, nuanced concepts can be measured. That's important for me. Understanding how college and its influence on students. This is probably the most used framework for understanding college and its impact on students. It's out of Sandy Aston's shop at UCLA. The book is Assessment for Excellence. This is basically the foundation for a lot of other models that have come forward in the higher education literature. It's the idea that students come to us with a variety of characteristics that we can't change. These are called inputs, right? Their high school GPA, high school involvement in interfaith activities, high school volunteer involvement. When they get to us, we can't change those things, okay? But they definitely play a role in what students select by way of the programs and activities they actually choose while they're at college. And they play a role probably in how students make gains just by the fact that they had a genuine interest at the beginning of their college experience, okay? Environments, that's what we get to play with, the college environment. How is it deconstructed? Oftentimes it's deconstructed into three different parts: an academic environment, a social environment, and what they're calling now a functional environment. Academic is intuitive, social is pretty intuitive. The functional is, where do students learn about financial aid? Who do they go to? Is that a social thing? Is it an academic thing? Where's that financial literacy lie if we want students to kind of graduate with some modicum of understanding about what loans are going to look like and what their paychecks are going to be looking like after they take out these enormous loans? If there are students in the audience, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be a wet whistle if you have major loans, but we can talk about that later. But what we're talking about here, when we're talking about DE, is we're talking about the programs specifically geared toward interfaith activities. What kind of programs are in place to really try and get students involved in interfaith interfaith activities. The outputs, any output that we're talking about here, these are like the learning outcomes you might think of. So critical thinking, right? I would say interfaith outcomes, moral reasoning, other outcomes of interest for a lot of assessment folks, retention, graduation rate, those types of things. We can't do anything about how students, when they come into high school, we can't do anything about this line. How they are is what they become to be. What we can do is create environments for any student who comes in that hopefully will get them to achieve certain outcomes. Does that make sense? So we're social engineers, people. We manipulate the environment of college in order for students to make gains on the outcomes we espouse that are important. Often articulated in mission statements, value statements, and whatnot. By way of interfaith activities, we get a little bit more deconstructed, if you will, within the E that I just spoke about. There are a lot of ways to think about the climate in which interfaith activities take place. There's always a socio-political, historical space or moment in which these environments exist. That's something that we need to acknowledge. We need to acknowledge the historical context of the institution. If you're programming for interfaith activities within a given institution, certainly that institution's history, mission will play a role in how those programs roll out, the words used to talk about those programs, how they fit into the strategic mission of the institution, how the president can speak about those programs. When we get more into the researchy end of things, we start talking about the different aspects of climate. There's structural diversity, so the numerical proportion of students who have worldview differences on your campus. So how many of your students are percent report Baptist? How many are percent report Presbyterian, Episcopalian, those types of things. There's the psychological climate. Are students actually discriminated against because of their faith tradition? How does that work out for them? Behavioral climate, do they actually participate in activities? How are they behaving? Do they take classes in interfaith? So we're really interested in that idea of formal participation in interfaith activities and informal. So again, here's the IEO model. These are the three outcomes that I'm going to speak to you about today in the original survey iteration. The three outcomes have to do with having appreciative attitudes toward other folks from other religious backgrounds. Okay? Specifically, after piloting this, it seemed that the ones that emerged as the most in need of trying to understand are appreciative attitudes toward secular students, or students who identify as atheist or humanist, those who identify as Muslim, as Jewish, as evangelical. We had Buddhist, we had Catholic, but when we actually were looking at that, there weren't enough students who actually had interactions with Buddhist students to even understand kind of what was going on with that. And also we had the Catholic. It was interesting because the way the data appeared for Catholics, it was very similar to the way they appeared. There was a split. For some Catholic students, they looked very much like evangelical students. For other Catholic students, they looked very much like secular students. And so, believe it or not, the patterns rolled out in a way that we had to we didn't use the same assessment battery for Catholics. So students will appreciate this. In the survey design, we try to keep them as short as possible for you. So that's why we have to make some of the decisions we make in terms of all these things. Self-authored worldview commitment, that's one of the most important constructs here. That's the one I discussed before. It's about coming to a commitment about your faith or tradition after wrestling with some of the issues that might have come up through encountering difference. It's not abandoning your faith. Okay, it's about how you make meaning of your faith in the face of difference. And then there's a pluralistic orientation. Again, a little bit controversial. Might need to reclaim the word pluralism a little bit. But it's this idea of, do you know about other religions? Do you have a religiously literate base? Have you read the Quran? Do you know what it says? Can you find the common elements across the sacred texts? Can you find the common virtues held by different religious backgrounds? Those are the kinds of things that kind of make up that construct. What's important here is that's a value that we hold the folks who are interested in this kind of work. It's, you can have whatever faith you want to have, but you need to have an appreciation for all the faith traditions. You need to have a knowledge base of the faith traditions in order to know how to interact with folks genuinely. Okay? That's part of what we're talking about today. So as an overview, in the overview of findings, we did a lot of survey development, a lot of piloting. Basically, it boiled down to 52 institutions of different types. about 14,000 students. In order to make meaning of the data as an overview, and one thing I think is important, we can always deconstruct these even further, but just for the sake of presentation and time, I put these together. Worldview majority students are basically all people who self-identified in some Christian category and a Catholic category. It just happened that in this survey administration, most of the Catholic students really responded like the evangelical students, believe it or not. So we put these folks together. Non-religious students were our atheist, agnostic, secular students. Worldview minority students included Jewish, they included Buddhist, they included Muslim. Another worldview, this is always the tricky part about doing survey research. So we have so many categories for students to choose to self-identify. It's ridiculous. No matter how many categories we always put other. You know, what do you say? And they type in answers. And some of them type in very thought out answers, and some of them just choose to say something like, you know, Baptist, even though Baptist is a category. So for some reason, the way we wrote it wasn't good enough. They wanted to write it themselves. So we had, and you know, we're faculty folks, so we had like a day-long argument about what to do with these people. And we decided to stay true to what the students were responding. So if the student said other, for whatever reason, we're assuming that they had the same sort of value in wanting to write something. So we put them together as another worldview. Even though some students did write Christians, some wrote Catholics, some wrote Jewish, and some wrote a variety of identification patterns and those types of things. We decided to keep them pure and not make judgments over what they intended and keep them out as their own group. Does that make sense? It's kind of important to understand. Okay, so this is just the basic descriptives. I'm going to get into some much more nuanced stuff as this goes through. But starting with the very basics. Oh, yes, go ahead.
What is diverse types, the 52 institutions?
So there's, we were talking about this last night. Type by way of control, is it public or is it private? So different type by way of region, you know, where is it in the region? Type by way of Carnegie classification. Is it a research comprehensive? Is it liberal arts? We had all the types in there. Does that make sense? So there's a place called the Carnegie Commission, if any of you heard of it. I'm sure your assessment folks have. It's kind of this commission that came up with the idea of grouping schools by the degrees they actually grant. And it's very flawed in a lot of ways, but it's a way to try to understand kind of some of the core values of each type of institution. And so we have representation across a variety of different types and controls. And when I present the data, what we've done in statistics world is controlled for that. So we controlled for the type of institution students went to see the effects between participation in interfaith activities and the outcomes. That makes sense? Yes? Yes? So it didn't matter where they went, here's the relationship, right? But we'll get there. Any other questions about this before I go on? Okay, satisfaction. So I hesitated to lead with this one because as the assessment people know, student satisfaction surveys are notoriously like crazy in terms of how to actually accurately gauge what students actually feel. But just as an overview, these are you know, how satisfied are students with the religion and worldview diversity on the campus. This is after controlling for all of the campuses, or the types that I was talking about. Oh, that's embarrassing. Hopefully nobody calls. Anyway, so all students, only 50% of all the students in the study reported that they were satisfied with the diversity on campus by way of worldview. That means 50% are not satisfied. 50% of all of these students wanted to see more worldview diversity on their campuses after controlling for type. So these are public school students, these are private school students. They want to see more of it. They want to learn while they're here. They expect to learn about other folks while they're here. They expect to learn about the nuances with understanding ISIS and what's going on while they're in college. That's why they're here. To avoid that is not doing service, I think, to the students that we expect to be equipped to be able to manage these issues both cognitively and behaviorally after college. Yes.
I'm sorry. Is that so it's a percentage for saying very accurate in the scale? Is it like very accurate,
right,
somewhat accurate,
yes,
kind of thing?
Yes.
So if that's all for the very accurate, that's much higher than I would have ever anticipated to be.
Well, it depends. You know, you're right. If we just selected some of the If we selected only for certain types of schools, the numbers would vary greatly, right? But this is across all of the schools.
Yeah.
So probably the publics are coming in a little bit higher, and some of the privates, more focused schools are coming in a little bit lower. And so this is kind of where it averages out. Yes? That makes sense?
Yeah.
So the worldview majority students are, of course, the most satisfied with this. The minority students not so satisfied, and the non-religious students not so satisfied. Okay? When we move to the next place, and this becomes critically important for a number of reasons, and I'm glad we have some of the folks in the audience representing international students. So international students, when they're thinking about going to college in the States, they're more interested in being able to express themselves freely by way of religion than they are by way of race. Okay? Race here is a domestic issue and an important one, and something we have to deconstruct and really understand by way of policies enacted to try and diversify the student body, as well as pedagogical practices to try and bring students from across race to a mutual understanding of what knowledge is and how to express it. By way of religion, by way of international students, they feel safe on campus based on how that campus lets them freely express their religious values and beliefs. So if international students are a focus for any particular school, especially the publics now, quite frankly, the publics need FTEs. Some of them are being strained financially and economically. And international students pay full tuition. So they're very interested in recruiting international students, and I would say to them, if you're really interested in recruiting international students, you better start thinking about what you're doing on your campus to make these students feel safe to freely express themselves by way of religion. Okay, any questions about that? So again, for international students, it's more important, I think, to think about creating spaces for freedom of religion than other forms of freedom. Well, that doesn't come out right, but you know what I mean. All right, so who is engaged in interfaith, right? So when we took a look at some of these interfaith activities, we wanted to know who was mostly engaged. These are, of course, across schools. High level of engagement is not really seen across any of the groupings, okay? There's more of a medium level of engagement for majority and minority students. And non-religious students are not engaging to the degree that either of those other groups are in interfaith activities. So there's something by the way of, when we took at the publics, they have things called multi-faith centers. They have the language used to describe spaces where students are supposed to be safe to come in, express themselves, talk about different spiritual and religious differences. Maybe the way that we're talking about those spaces are alienating to students who identify as atheist, agnostic, or humanist. So they're not coming into those spaces, and a lot of times those spaces are where your campus ministry team is that actually does the interfaith work. So it's a lot, and there's power in naming. So there's a lot of that going on, so we're hypothesizing why this is happening. But for the most part, you'll see there's an equal distribution between folks in the worldview majority and the worldview minority in terms of engaging in interfaith activities. We would like that number to be higher from a value perspective for those of us who are into interfaith, but it's interesting to see the differences. Questions about this? Yes?
A multi-faith center might be alienating to a devout Muslim too.
Absolutely.
So the whole idea of building a multi-faith center so that many faiths come together might be not a very good idea.
I think that there's no silver bullet, right? So you have to take the context of the institution in mind. When you're thinking about it. What's that?
It's a very American thing to build such a center, pluralism. Necessarily.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, yeah, again, it's where we are in our space, in our historical location as well as the institution's location. NYU has a multi-faith center, but because of where it's located on the block and some of the history of NYU, it's called the Catholic Center. But it's the multi-faith center, Catholic in small c. You know what I mean? And so they had to maintain that as part of the rights of the property. And so that's kind of it's a little alien. I mean, who would think to go into there if you're a Muslim student to find freedom of expression? So there are no silver bullets. And so it's interesting to talk to each campus and see what might work for them in terms of creating interfaith spaces or spaces named in a certain way, not to alienate any student. I think that's important. So thank you. Okay, so formal interfaith engagement. All right. In terms of the ways students are participating in interfaith work, I didn't say the last way, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit because I think it's an important message to hammer home. But the ways they're engaging is in working with others on service projects, engaging in interfaith action and dialogue, attending a religious service for a worldview other than their own, and utilizing what their students are understanding as a multi-faith space. So in terms of what we were trying to understand in this whole idea of formal interfaith activities, these are the ones that students are participating in rank order to the greatest degree. Again, controlling for the campus type and those types of things. In terms of what is actually working on a campus, it's working with others on service projects, mostly having to do with poverty and hunger. Those types of formal interfaith activities are the ones that tend to lead to the outcomes I just talked about earlier. The least effective is debate. Okay? Students debating. Students are not interested in debating about religion and worldview. They are not interested in attending debates about which worldview is correct. We know from the literature that this is just Belenky Clinchy a long time ago in talking about women's ways of knowing. We know that women, in fact, do not learn as much from debating as men do. It's a very privileged concept, this idea of debate. It invokes certain cognitive strategies that privilege people who tend to be more in the norm than people who are not. And so this is now bearing out in the research having to do with religion. So if you're thinking about doing an interfaith practice, it's probably not a great idea to invite people together to debate. To share, sure. To talk about different ideas, like how are evangelicals addressing the issue of hunger? How are Muslims addressing the issue of hunger? Fine. But debating about which one is right, not working. Okay? In terms of the outcomes that we looked at, other outcomes it might be working for, but in terms of the ones we're looking at, not so much.
It makes sense that the working towards the service project is the number one in terms of that, all the social psychological research, Gordon Allport's work, contact theory kinds of things, working towards common goal, equal status context. So that makes a lot of sense, and that would be the most beneficial.
Yep, and to kind of blur one and two of what you're saying, it's important when you're doing those service projects to bring the students of the different faith traditions together to co-construct which ones to go for in order to create that equal status.
Yep. Yep.
If you're imposing, that means your narrative is taking shape and playing it out, and the people who are more likely to align with your narrative will be the most likely to attend. So it's got to come from a student kind of base and corral and the consensus decision as to which issue they're going to go after, because like I said, every context is nuanced. A New York University student might be very interested in a housing issue, for example, where here that might not be so much of an issue, but it's about the students and bubbling up, right? Other questions? Ideas, concerns? I'm sure there are, and we can talk later. So there's high levels of informal interfaith stuff going on. So when we're asking students, when are you really interacting with other people and talking about issues having to do with worldview difference? A lot of our students are basically saying it's in social gatherings, they're studying with students. Some students are saying they're working on academic projects, they dined. So there's an informal aspect here. This is a good thing and a bad thing, okay? When we get into the literature base on intergroup dialogue, and we're stealing a little bit from race here, from race work, what we know is that when left to their own vices, oftentimes students in social spaces have these types of interactions and they don't necessarily grow from them. Oftentimes, it's not to say we prevent them as social engineers, but we need to provide spaces, either in curricular spaces or co-curricular spaces that have definite boundaries, definite rules, definite ground rules for how to engage the space, so that students will learn. If those rules aren't in place, oftentimes students will engage difference and either retreat from it and go back to stereotype, right? Or just disengage entirely. This is something I don't want to deal with while I'm in college, I need to get to the bar. You know what I mean? So it's our job as educators, and I put co-curricular education in the same boat as curricular education. It's our job to create these spaces, to have these rules, to have these boundaries. It's our job, my job, to create teachers who actually know how to facilitate dialogue in these ways. And so while these things might be happening, they're not necessarily yielding the benefits that you might think along the outcomes that we're measuring. Does that make sense? A lot of Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat is in here. So 75% of the students said they've never been mistreated on campus because of their worldview, which means 25% says they have. 73 report hearing insensitive comments, and the top 3 sources of these insensitive comments come from friends or peers, 40%, classroom discussions. Interesting. Do faculty even know how to engage these topics thoughtfully? You know, when faculty introduce diversity in the classroom, they say, "Ooh, I've got to get a person of religious difference or a person of color in my syllabus," and then they throw some reading in there, but they've never been trained on how to actually thoughtfully engage students across difference in ideas in the classroom. That's an indictment on faculty folks. I'm one of them, and got to get up to speed. Social activities, again, you know, those are in the co-curricular spaces. Are co-curricular educators versed in how to deal with these conflicts, or not even conflicts, just engage these kind of rich and important topics in the programs and activities that they have on campus? Make sense?
I'm talking too much. Just
No,
shut me
you
up.
never talk.
The classroom discussion part, I really think is interesting in terms of the insensitive comments. It's almost to a degree to where it might not be an honest conversation if there aren't any insensitive comments. So it might not be a good. I'm not saying that we should purposely do that, but if you're making it a space to where it's okay to say what your biases are, say what your, you know, all those other kinds of things, then you almost kind of say, for it to be a good experience, you might need some somebody willing to say some insensitive comments to get things out.
I'm tracking with you 1,000,000%. Here's the difference. So in the survey development phase of this and the race stuff I did before, students understand insensitive different than uncomfortable. Okay? Discomfort, when properly supported, often leads to growth and change. Insensitive, no. There's a difference there. Okay, but that's a great point. Something that needs to be brought up. It's okay to be uncomfortable, but there has to be supportive spaces to resolve the discomfort. When students are reading surveys, and students, you can chime in if you want. I'm assuming there are students in the room. Are there students in the room? Okay, thank God. You know, I'm getting so old that everybody under the age of like 30 looks like a student to me. But yeah, so I think students. Often when they're reading surveys, they can make a difference, and we found those differences in insensitivity versus discomfort. Discomfort's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so as far as the constructs, what we keep talking about here, and this is just an example of Muslim students. So we ask students if they have an appreciative attitude toward Muslims, and here are some of the examples or the items that they see. Do you agree with this? Do you think that Muslims actually do these things? They're kind of all mixed together, but these are just some of the examples of what I talk about when I talk about appreciative attitudes towards one of these groups. What's distinctive about our survey is that, let me start this way. Historically, what surveys like this have tried to do is they've tried to say something to students like this, so I'm looking at you, all right? Think about somebody different than yourself. Now, please rate the following items. You know, how comfortable are you with that? I mean, there's nothing we can do with that. We have no idea who they're thinking about. They could be thinking about, you know, the person down the hallway who's an introvert versus an extrovert. I mean, we have no idea what they're thinking about. So what we've done in this survey is we've asked about specific groups so that students are really responding to specific groups. Now remember, we can look at how students are responding to these appreciative attitudes toward Muslim students question by how they self-identify. So we can see if, for example, Christian students have a deeper appreciation than Jewish students. We can see if Presbyterians have more of a open, appreciative attitude than Baptists, for example. We can see all of those things. But this is kind of what goes in to thinking about what we're talking about with regards to these students. I should say that the base of this is Muslim, but once we move to Jews or Mormons or evangelical Christians, we just kind of replace these words with their words. Right? So these are the things that we, in the literature base, we see that they hold in common. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Self-authored worldview commitment. Lots of stuff in here. I don't want to get too much into it, but it's this idea, again, I wanted to just say, it's having to reconcile competing religious perspectives before committing to your own. Talk and listen to people with different points of view before committing to your own. Integrated those points of view. Thoughtfully considered other religious. So it's this idea of encountering religious difference and wrestling with it. Again, not encouraging students necessarily to abandon their faith. Okay, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about self-authored, which is Robert Keegan in Harvard, and Marsha Beck from Golda, Worldview Commitment, okay? Pluralistic orientation, so this is the one that tries to bring everything together. This is the other. World religions share many common values. You can read the list. Worldview inspires me to serve others on issues of common concern. It's important to serve those of diverse religious backgrounds and issues of common concern. Again, we started with a lot of items here based on some of Diana Eck's work, based on some other folks' work, and these are the ones that fleshed out by way of how students were thinking to kind of create this construct. I could talk more about item by item later. Let me get through this. How am I doing on time here? Am I doing
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So here's what I wanted to show. So let's take 2 of the outcomes, okay? Worldview commitment, pluralistic orientation, right? Low, medium, and high interfaith engagement, okay? What you can see here is students who are more likely to engage in interfaith activities after controlling for everything under the sun, worldview, type of school, you name it, are more likely to have this worldview commitment that is shaped from encountering difference. Does that make sense? The ones with the lowest interfaith engagement, grouped all together, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of everything else, are under, like they're the least likely. This is very clear in this outcome, right? So if you want students to come to a worldview commitment that's based on encountering difference and wrestling with those ideas, you should be having students participate more frequently in interfaith practices and activities. For pluralistic orientation, it's not so dramatic, which as a measurement person you love, because it means the measure's sensitive enough to pick up on things, the patterns are not the same. But you can still see that there's an effect there for high engagement in informal faith activities. So to get through everything, interfaith engagement matters. The future here is to try and understand it after having a pretest of all of those outcomes of interest. So if we can get students when they come in the door and understand how much they appreciate other religions, for example, as how they're committed to their worldview, for example, and we can control for that, then we can really isolate the effects of participating in a particular program on the outcome. Right now, this is all cross-sectional, so this is all just correlational relationships. This survey, the new survey, is one that actually does this longitudinally. We're going after 120 campuses to participate in the study. We're doing very well on recruitment. It's free. It's totally funded. Student incentives are paid by the funder. And what we're doing is we're tracking students at 3 time points. Fall of 2015, all first-year students, fall 2015, then at the end of their first year, and then at the end of their senior year. Okay? And we're trying to really understand development over time and how interfaith activities actually promote growth in these areas over time. In closing, I'll say, back to the full circle evangelical frame. I think it's important to know other people. I think it's important to be a good neighbor. I think it's important to bring people together. And I think it's important for a variety of reasons, whether it's witnessing or otherwise. You need to know the folks that you're going to be interacting with. And that's what this is really trying to do. You need to appreciate them. You also need to understand, how might your commitment change to wrestling with these differences? Or how might it stay the same? Or will it deepen? Or will it strengthen? I don't think any of these outcomes are necessarily anti the evangelical way of thinking about college and university life. It's just a different way of reclaiming kind of what we're trying to do. That's all I have. Questions, comments, concerns? Come on, I'm going to meet with Phil Riken in a couple weeks, people. Come on. Yeah, go ahead.
So Bethel is a faith exclusive institution.
Right.
Several people would like
At least
to
on the CAS side.
CAS.
CAS. CAS.
So how do we do interfaith dialogue in a faith exclusive?
Well, that assumes that all formal interfaith practice is going to happen within the boundaries of the brick and mortar, right? Don't you have Frogtown and some other places around here where evangelical students can go by major, by interest, into the neighborhoods where these other folks are and help out the neighborhoods or whatever? I mean, that's interfaith, but it's initiated from within the college, but not constrained by the college fortress. Does that make sense? Who's going to initiate those conversations? It's got to come from the faculty and who are my people, my student affairs staff. Yeah.
So Matt, how do you bridge that connection between student affairs and academics?
Oh, that's an age-old question. I think it's happening very well here, actually. From what I've heard, from the stories I've heard, it seems like faculty really know the student affairs folks, and I think that's really a positive sign. At other schools like mine, I don't even know who they are a lot of times. I know who the head honchos are, but I don't know who they are very often. But I think it is a successful collaboration across both. Oftentimes, the co-curricular people are more versed in how to handle these issues than the faculty, because the way we do graduate education is more defined. You know, you're a TA in a class, and then you're expected to teach and understand race differences in the class. And faculty are very uncomfortable with handling any of that. And oftentimes they don't go forward and try to teach themselves in any meaningful way. And there's a whole reward structure thing in place there. But oftentimes we can learn from our co-curricular friends because they're in spaces by way of their organizations and their peers where religious literacy is now almost a core value. It's almost a core competency. So now as somebody who trains future student affairs educators, that means for us, we have to get religious literacy into the curriculum for the master's degree students who are going to graduate and have to do this work in co-curricular spaces. Yes?
Also in our curriculum, all VTAG courses could potentially do this. There's a place in our curriculum for this. I have a question about your model.
Yeah.
The notion that our commitment should be self-authored
Yes.
really presupposes, or at least is consistent with an extremely high degree of human autonomy, a very enlightenment assumption, maybe construct, and the notion that you wouldn't make commitments until you've examined all of the alternatives also is very consistent with the enlightenment notion of human beings as a blank slate. And I think those are highly questionable assumptions on many, many different levels. It's something to think about.
I agree, and I think that it's something we can take offline if you'd like to, because there's a lot of conversation around this. Believe it or not, going into the development of that construct. I can tell you that the words self-authored are mortifying, not only to the folks who coined them now, because they are very Western in their orientation in a way. And like you said, it's all about the person and kind of, yes, but we could talk about that as we move forward. And presupposing that a commitment should become from different interactions across difference. What we're trying to see here, though, is at pretest, they might not have had a lot of encountering difference before making their commitment. And so at pretest, we would expect them to maybe have students to have a certain score or orientation that way. After coming to college, there is a presupposition that we would want students to encounter difference before coming into any commitment, whether it's a commitment about their career, whether it's a commitment about who they marry, their lifestyle choices. We do have a value that encountering difference should lead to growth when that difference is properly supported, either in curricular or co-curricular spaces. So you're picking up on that value, and that's something that can be challenged. And I'm totally open to that, but we can talk about that, absolutely. Other questions?
I'll just interject a comment too that Dr. Mayhew's presence here is part of an initiative that we've received funding for to kind of work on how do we do this work best at Bethel, how do we expand the work that we're already doing in addition to our interfaith service programming. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunities for conversations between the three strands of the institution, opportunities for faculty development. We're working on a 1-year to 5-year plan of what might we like to do as an institution and how do we get ourselves there. So a lot of these questions are things that we're working on, and we'll continue to have opportunity for faculty participation in those conversations.
I think there's important for our institution, one of the things we talk about as looking at as a gen ed outcome in essence is evaluating and owning your own faith. This idea, you come here with your parents' faith, how is it that we can get it so this is your faith? And I think in terms of when you talk about the diversity within a group, you can have that for students here of growing up in a Calvinist family talking with Armenian or something, a very different kind of ideas in terms of how to understand their Christian faith as well. So that can be, in some ways, that's a different worldview conversation as well, even though it's within the same, same faith.
That's right. My roommate in college was very Calvinist and I was not. And we used to get in arguments all the time about that. And when we took a road trip after we graduated, the whole house did in this big van. And they wouldn't let us sit together until the final leg. And then they let us sit together and they just said, you two need to figure this out. But that was after graduation. We never really did. We were still very good friends. But yeah, that kind of thing, absolutely. Other issues, comments, concerns? Well, thank you so much for coming. There's food. I'd love to chat with you. If you have cards and you want to communicate, I'm happy to do that. So yes, thank you all. I appreciate everybody.